At long last, we are back with part 4 of the Frostfell series, the final installment. So today we're going to be talking about the mixing and the mastering, and rather than talking too much about the technicalities of it, I thought I'd just show you some of the tracks and show you some of the unique challenges that came with these tracks, as well as just my general approach to mixing and mastering. Okay, let's start off by having a look at the Gates of Frostfell, mostly just because this was the first track that I wrote, and it really set the tone for the rest of the album. So you'll see here, this is kind of the basic template that I've got for each of these tracks. It changes a bit, but it's mostly the same. We have a bunch of pitched percussion here. We got tongue drums, metal drums. We've also got a little bit lower what became the live glockenspiel. There was a point in time when it was virtual. I've also got a couple synths here, simple pads short. We've got a couple effects running through some of these as well. I like to use Valhalla's Shimmer for some of these things, really like big open sounds. We've got bass drums, which became a big part of the album as well, just these big boom hits. Then moving on to kind of keyboards. We have some hand chimes, and we've got the Noir piano from Contact. It's a really nice piano that just gives this Nils Fromm-ish kind of muted sound. And then we've got our live instruments here. We've got flute, clarinet, some percussion, which was varied from track to track, glockenspiel, and then the string sections here. And you'll notice that I separated out some of these strings based on what they were playing. The col legnos, pizzicatos, I actually put these on separate tracks because I wanted slightly different mixing effects for these that we'll talk about. And then lastly, we've got our Autoharps. These are things I got in the back. They're kind of like strumming folk instruments. Dulcimers, again, strumming folk instruments. Mountain dulcimers, a virtual instrument. And then lastly, this is Klopfgeist. So this was a patch that I used quite a bit through the album. It's actually what the metronome is in Logic, but I used it as a synth because it had this nice booming synth. And usually I'd use it to kind of accompany the bass drum and give like a deep pitch to this. That's pretty much it. So let's take a look at how I went about and mix some of these. I'm gonna solo out some of this for you. So the main ostinato that we've got in this is this tongue drum and metal drum. It was a combination of virtual stuff from my own samples, as well as a couple live things. Okay, so the way that I handled this, there's a couple elements going on. You'll notice there's kind of what sounds like a pad in the background, but that pad is actually just running through the bus of the tongue drum and the metal drums. So as they play this pattern, you notice if I turned this shimmer feature off, we would just hear what the ostinato is. And that's really all that's happening, but we have it also being bussed, you'll see, to some effects here. This is something that I do pretty commonly throughout my tracks. I do this quite a bit. And that is I'll pitch stuff up, I'll run it through a bus, I'll pitch it up an octave, I'll mix it in, and then I'll throw in the reverbs with, again, mixing that in as well. In this case, I also did some effects that I automated for some subtlety, which was it's called step effects, but basically it allows you to control a bunch of things, including like this arpeggiated sound. It gives it an extra little quality. I'll see if you can hear that. So here as it goes on, it's getting just an extra little pattern. Again, subtlety is really important when you're doing these mixes, I think, and adding lots of nuance and detail in the back allows for this kind of like repeated listening experience instead of just surface level material. This is also a pretty noticeable effect I did in this track, but I took the virtual piano that I had and the virtual hand chimes, I bounced them out, I believe I reversed them, and then added an echo, like a delay to it, and then reversed them back to normal. So the effect that you get is this sort of sound. I'll solo these out. And again, there is some extra echo even happening on the reversed version. I like to use Echo Boy Jr. I think this thing is just a beast, and it's just so good at capturing lots of different types of echoes. It really blends well in the mix, and it's all over this album. I'll link a bunch of the plugins that I use below if you're interested in checking those out as well. In terms of other effects that I did beyond just EQ and compression, which we'll talk about, I also used Valhalla's Room quite a bit. That was kind of really the basis, and I spent a lot of time crafting the reverb on this album, making sure it was just the way I like it. So what it wound up being was a combination of Space Designer and Valhalla. If you look at these settings here, it's pretty consistent through the album. It does change a little bit. It looks like a TV studio here. It's got like a 2.5 second reverb, maybe 2 seconds. And then also just the standard Valhalla, but with a very large tail here. I would recommend, if you're using reverbs, to play with multiple reverbs in combination, only because different reverbs have different strengths, and you can create a really unique kind of sound with your reverb if you combine as opposed to just using one standard plugin. So I usually use Space Designer for the kind of basically just setting the room, and then I use Valhalla more for kind of just the tails. So if you listen, this is a Bode Glockenspiel that I recorded live, and here's how it sounds with the reverbs. Super quiet. Again, just subtle texture stuff in the background. I also did the same kind of thing with dulcimer. I would be bowing a lot of the dulcimer. Yep. I think that's a pretty recognizable sound in the album. Here's some of the Autoharp. That's panned with delay. And that's got some, I think, some echo. Yeah, so again, all of this is just texture setting, just adding extra color beyond just the regular orchestra. Let's take a look at the Klopfgeist too. So this is adding some of the really bassy synth stuff. Now that's accompanying the cello and the piano. So that just, again, adds an extra level of depth to it. Let me play the piano for you, and the cello and the Klopfgeist. So here it is without it. All right, now here it is with it, and that cello. So it's subtle, but it does add an extra level of kind of oomph to it and push. Okay, so that's kind of like talking about some of the nuanced stuff. Let's actually just take a look at now at the general mixing. So best mixing practices, as you're composing, as you're orchestrating, you want to be considering mix as well, I think. And considering where these instruments' registers are falling and what really needs to be accentuated or cut. I treated the tongue drums, those sorts of things, as this kind of middle bed that was going on. And so naturally, as I'm mixing those things, I want to make sure that, you know, we're not having an excess of lows or anything like that. There's 2 EQs here. I cut all the lows, cut even some of the middle, and just bumped some of the highs. Now, if I didn't do that, just for reference, if I didn't cut any of those lows, we would be having something like this. And instead, we have something like this. So you notice by scooping out all those lows, naturally I've allowed more room for low elsewhere in the mix. And that's where we have things like the bass drum. I wanted to have that be able to be low. I wanted to have the piano, and even the cello as well, and the clop. Same goes for the high end, of course, making sure that your high end is balanced. I find oftentimes that a lot of VSTs lose a lot of the high end simply because they're trying to do noise reduction. So they're trying to get rid of a lot of the noise floor, the room ambience, that sort of thing, and they're naturally scooping and scooping and scooping a lot of those highs. So oftentimes I find I have to artificially bump a lot of the highs, which I did throughout this album. That's pretty much it for this track. Let's move on to another track. Let's move on to Leaving Home so you can see a more classically mixed track. Okay, so here is Leaving Home. Now you'll notice it looks a bit different, but the overall template is the same. I just was deleting out anything that I didn't need once the track was kind of locked in and ready to go. Much more orchestral now. We have a lot more live instrumentation, and only at the very end do we really pop in a bunch of the virtual stuff. So I'm gonna show you what this sounded like without any of the plugins on the orchestral stuff. All right, so here's the orchestral stuff completely dry. etc. Okay, we have piano up there, but I won't get to that. Work needs to be done. It sounds very bass heavy. Some stuff is getting drowned out, and obviously there's not like that warmth that we're looking for yet. So I'll show you what I wound up doing. On all of my tracks, I put a gain, because gain setting is really important, making sure you get the levels right as best you can without adjusting the volume too much. You have the most control with volume when you're at 0, because if you notice, as I'm dragging this 0, see we're moving in tenths, right? But as we get farther down here, you'll notice that even these subtle movements are more dramatic. And when we're farthest down here, now all of a sudden it's getting harder and harder and harder to fine tune. When we're down here, it's like, oh, we're moving in like 0.5 each time. So it's good to gain set, get it close, and then work with 0 as best you can. So yeah, gain setting is the first thing. Then generally EQing, and EQing for me is just a matter of cutting some of the room tone where I need to, accentuating things, cutting things again. So I've done that here. Here it is with proper gain setting and with EQ. So you'll see most of those problems can be solved with just proper levels and proper EQ, which is good. You really want to work like step by step and only add things that you need to. I worked with compression where I needed to on the track. So when I wanted things to sound more just generally uniform in terms of their volumes and levels, that's where compression would come in. And I created my own custom one called ZH Light Orchestral, and that was one that I applied throughout this album on all these tracks. Again, when I found something that I liked, I would save it as a preset and use it throughout, because I find that easier than just trying to remember all the settings. So here is everything again, now with compression. So particularly in the winds, we're getting a lot more presence than we had before, and that's exactly what I wanted here. Then we've got our kind of custom reverbs, even a little bit more EQ in some spots for just general cuts and boosts, those sorts of things. So here is everything now with my reverb settings, and pretty much now everything's been added. You'll see I'm working, one of my reverbs is a 3-second tail with most of the highs cut, so that we're really just working with some of the warm mid to lows. And then my other reverb is a 2-second reverb with much less depth. So that effect is a bit just roomy, just giving some more room presence. And then the last effect that I added just on the kind of bus for these orchestral instruments was the BX Solo. This is actually a free plugin that just gives a little bit of extra width. I'll see if you can hear the difference between these. It's on. It's a very subtle effect, but subtlety is important when you're mixing, because not every effect needs to be in your face for it to make a difference, especially when it comes to the mastering. Let's take a look at Showdown. That'll be the last track we'll look at for the mix, and then we'll talk briefly about the master. All right, here's Showdown, and man, this thing was a beast to mix. Oh my goodness. By far, this track took the longest to mix of anything on the album. The more tracks you have, the more considerations you have to make, and again, you're balancing this macro and micro thinking. So you're thinking, what does this one individual track need? But then how does this track fit in the context of the entire song itself? And those considerations obviously take more time the more tracks you have. So you'll notice a lot of these are bust out into separate elements. Again, we have the Frostfell ensemble. We've got pads, we've got keys and strums, we've got percussion, we've got piano, and then we've got 8-bit synths in here, this is the only track that has this bus, and I'll talk about that in a second. Let's just solo out some of the elements so you can just hear things in isolation, and then we'll talk about how I approach this. Here's some of the percussion. Piano. Some of the pads. Here's the 8-bit synths. Bet you didn't notice that. Percussion. Okay, so that's just a little preview of some of the different buses here. Yeah, so the 8-bit synths was, like I said, it was the only track that I decided to do this, and in part it was inspired by Link's Awakening. I felt that this was the climactic section. We needed something that we hadn't heard in the rest of the album, and I thought it might be kind of fun to add just a little bit of synthetic push towards the rest of the orchestra. So here it is without it, just so you can hear what it contributed. So of course very orchestral, but lacking some of the, I don't know, the climactic elements. So here it is with the synths. Again, I wouldn't say it's the leading voice of this section, but it definitely does add something. Beyond just EQing and stuff, which we've talked about, this track also required a lot of accuracy from the players. And a lot of that was done through multiple takes, but also through quantization things. So I used the quantization through Logic's built in, and I also did some manual editing myself. You'll notice a lot of this is edited pretty strongly, as well as intonation and pitch and stuff. These players were incredible. But again, just for album's sake, recording sessions, and expedience, some of this stuff I handled in post, just to make it all really glued together. There's also an effect that I've heard a lot of people talking about that they really liked. That is this reverse effect. This was, again, something I added just for fun. It's the piano note. If I cut everything, you'll hear that it's actually just a piano note, just reversed. That's it. But with a bit crusher in there, it gives an extra subtle thing just to add a bit of punch. Along with the Doombeck, which Frank recorded right here. Fun little effect there. Looking at the pads, I mostly scooped a lot of the highs because I wanted to leave that for the ensemble, and just kind of focused on the mids and just light textures. Very quiet. Just setting some effects. But again, without the pads in the beginning, you'll notice it feels a little bit more empty. Subtlety is king. Then taking a look at the percussion. The percussion was a little bit trickier because we're working with a lot of different elements. So I wanted sticks. These are a bunch of different drumsticks that Frank played. I wanted these to sound kind of distant. And then as it comes in, we get a more dry effect. I also included in this track, which I didn't in the rest, Mandolin Strums. Not for any folk reason, but just because mandolin gives a really nice percussive snap that I like. And we've got the Doombeck here. Here's that on its own. With a little bit of 8-bit, just kind of glue everything together for when the 8-bit comes in later. Then we also have snare that comes in here. Stereo tracked. Let's see, we did left and right. So you notice I actually had things tracked, but I muted them just for variety. Again, little arrangement decisions later. And we've also got some effects here, like the bass drum again. This is a different bass drum than I had before because I wanted something that was less boomy and more like bah. Also, a recommendation for bass drums. If you want things to sound more boomy, ironically, they work better in their quiet register than they do in their loud. Here it is quieter. You'll notice it's like boom. When I make it loud, it has a little bit less boom and more ba, boom ba. And then the last section I haven't really chatted about is the keys and strums. Strums just being like dulcimers, which I don't think I used here actually. So it was mostly just keys, and that would be like celeste, hand chimes, and my warm bell pad, which I made for this album. That's a subtle thing you don't necessarily hear again. But again, just kind of punctuating stuff that's already going on in the orchestra. So yeah, that's how I approach these different sections. And I would say the most important thing for this track in particular to make it all glue was compression. I spent a lot of time getting the compression right, and I really allotted that to different instruments. It gives you a bit more control. You're gluing things together when you're using it in buses, but you're pushing instruments forward, I find, when you're using them on individual tracks, and that's how I handled it. Without the compression, a lot of this oomph would be lost. And this colorful beast is the mastering. So this is the final stage. This is how I like to approach mastering. I'm sure other people do it differently, but I like to have everything laid out in front of me so I can quickly toggle back and forth between the tracks. The way that I approach mastering, again, it's all about subtlety, so you don't want to make too many dramatic adjustments unless you really need to. But the whole intent is that you're trying to glue all the tracks together. So you'll notice that all of these tracks don't have very much on them. Usually it's just gain, EQ, maybe another different type of EQ. In this case, I like to use Waves stereo EQ. It's non-visual. I just like it because it does a little bit of better job with boosting some of the highs and things like that. So if we move through here, I won't talk too much about it, but I'll just show some of the differences between the two. So here's the gates of Frostfell before I applied my mastering. And then here's after. Okay, so right off the bat, I noticed that there's a big gain boost. Here is 6 dBs of gain. We're trying to find that peak where we don't clip it, but we also add enough that it has some presence. In some cases, that means you'll have to make some cuts, which in this case I did. I cut some of the mids, cut a little bit of the high mids as well. And then looking at the waves, I assume, yeah, looks like in most of these tracks, I actually wound up bumping a pretty significant amount of the highs. Here's the gain boosted without the EQ settings that I did. And here it is with. You know, I wanted the darkness of winter, but I also really wanted to convey the kind of bright, shimmery elements as well, and that's why I had to do a lot of high boosts. The same goes for other tracks. They all probably had very similar things, if I imagine. Yeah, let's see. Okay, so similar stuff here in Boy and His Dog. Let's see, I bet I bumped the highs too. Yep, sure did. So because I focused on continuity throughout this process, the mastering was not overly complex, mostly just getting the gains right. Also, considering that I wanted some of these tracks to loop and I hadn't mixed them as loops, I had to create those loops as well in these. So you'll notice here is where the loop point happens. Now I had the volume duck a little bit because if I had just kept that at the normal volume, we probably would have clipped. I also will use one project file for my mastering because it allows me to determine how much space I want between tracks. So I was able to space these out appropriately. Or if I wanted a seamless loop. So let's see, in this case, we had some space, so. That gives me the kind of control that I like. And like I said, it allows me to quickly toggle, so I can listen back and go, okay, let's see the volume of this. make sure that everything is working properly, making sure that the most climactic section of the album is the loudest or feels the loudest. Those are all things that are really important to me. That's pretty much it. And that's gonna do it. With that, we've finished out the series. I hope you enjoyed it. It was, again, so much fun, and I just want to extend, again, a huge thank you to all of you who have opted to purchase the album. It really, really means a lot to me, and hearing your positive feedback, I couldn't be happier with it. It really was such a joy to create this album, to work with these players, and to share my process with you. If you enjoy this kind of content, you want to see more stuff like this, please let me know, and I'd be happy to do so. You can expect more coming soon, not just piano covers and synthesias, but also more educational stuff. It's really fun to talk with you guys and share what I know and learn as well. Thanks again for watching. See you in the next video.